Okay, year 11. So we are about halfway through our topic of natural hazards. And in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the effects of tropical storms. So we're moving away from where tropical storms are found and how they are formed to the impacts that they have. And then in the next lesson, we're going to be looking at the responses. So we're going to be focusing on Typhoon Haiyan, which happened in November 2013. And we're going to be analysing photographs to describe the impacts of Typhoon Haiyan, and then use examples to describe the primary and the secondary effects of Typhoon Haiyan. Okay, so the first thing I'd like you to do is read through these statements and decide whether you think they are true or false. So pause the video, and then when you play again, we will go through the answers. So tropical storms are also called typhoons, cyclones, and also hurricanes. Is true. Tropical storms form in cold oceans is false. The oceans have to be at least 26.5 degrees in temperature. Tropical storms bring heavy rain. True, and that's through the cumulonimbus clouds. Tropical storms gain power over land. That's false. They actually lose power because their source of energy comes from the water. Tropical storms form in the tropics and equatorial regions. You could say true or false depending on that. It's quite vague. The actual specific answer would be between 5 and 15 degrees north and south of the equator. So if you put true or false, I'm okay with that. Tropical storms bring very powerful wind speeds of between 75 and 200 miles per hour is true. A 75 mile per hour storm is classed as a category 1, and 155 mile per hour is classed as a category 5. Tropical storms aren't very wide. That's false. They can be up to 600 miles in width. So that's just a recap based on previous lessons. Okay, so let's focus then on Typhoon Haiyan. So on November the 8th, 2013 at 4:40 a.m. local time, a category 5 typhoon struck the Philippines. So this happened in Asia. Okay, now we know that Asia is found within the tropical regions, so that's like a common place for a typhoon to occur. And I just want to draw your eyes to the fact it was a category 5. So category 5, you know, it's one of the most powerful tropical storms, which means that catastrophic damage will occur, as shown at the bottom of this diagram. So it might actually be worth writing down categories 1 to 5 so you know the detail of each. Typhoon Haiyan originated in the northwest Pacific Ocean, and it was one of the most powerful typhoons to hit the Philippines, with recorded wind speeds of up to 314 kilometers per hour, which is 195 miles per hour. So it was way above a category 5 storm. It was traveling actually 40 miles faster than necessary to be a category 5 storm. So here are the facts. 6,190 people died. 14.1 million people were affected, and of those 14.1 million people, over a third of those, so 4.8 million, lived in poverty. The overall damage was $12 billion. 1 million farmers were affected, so people working in the primary sector and the secondary sector. 1.1 million houses were damaged, so people will have been left homeless, as it says there. 4.1 million people were made homeless. And if your levels of homelessness are high, that is overall going to impact the amount of people affected, the amount of money that was lost, and also possibly the amount of people that died if they didn't get responded to fast enough. So please make sure that you've written down the facts from the board to build up a mini fact file about Typhoon Haiyan. This information here is the information that you would use. So if you were doing a load question and you were locating it, all of this information would come into your location about where Typhoon Haiyan happened, how many people it impacted, and how fast it was travelling. Okay, so what we have here on the board are lots of different figures that you would need to interact with. So in an exam, this typically would be a 2 or a 3 mark question where it's asking you to use the figures to describe the track of Typhoon Haiyan. So you can see here that this figure here, let's call this figure 3, is showing us the dates, the times, the lines of latitude and longitude, and the wind speed. So it's showing you the track. Now this arrow here on map 1 is essentially showing us that track that's being described in figure 3. And then this figure here, figure 2, is zooming into the Philippines, so you can see them in a little bit more detail because it's quite small on this one. So I would like you to use all of these figures to describe the track of Typhoon Haiyan. So I'll do one example with you together, and then I'm going to carry on so you can pause the screen and carry on describing the track of Typhoon Haiyan on your own. So Typhoon Haiyan started in, well, it says here it started at lines of latitude 6 degrees north, which is roughly here, and 146 degrees east. So it roughly started about here. Okay, so it happened, so you might want to write actually here, it started 6 degrees north and 146 degrees east, okay, which is in, you know, if this is Pacific Ocean, we've got north, east, south, west. It happened in the south or the southeast Pacific Ocean. So this is the southeast Pacific Ocean. And this was on the 5th of the 11th, and you could be even really more specific, at midnight, okay? And then it started to move in a northerly direction. So it was traveling kind of in this direction, which would be like northwest. It's traveling in this direction, so it's going like that. So it started to move northwest towards, and you could say towards the Philippines. And you might want to mention then here the next lines of latitude and longitude. So you can decide how much detail you go into this, it's up to you, but try and make sure you interact with all of the figures, figures 1, figure 2, and figure 3. Okay, so now we know where the tropical storm originated and where it travelled to. We need to now look at the impact. So from the starter, we know we have a little fact file about Typhoon Haiyan, but if you were asked a question where you had to use figures, so it could be using figure 1 and figure 2, identify or suggest whether the primary or the secondary impacts were the worst, you would be expected to be able to analyse and interpret what the images are showing us. So let's take on a geographical skill of analysing photographs and do this together. Okay, so what can we see in this image? Well, we can see here, first of all, that there has been a lot of surface water. And that could have come from two things. That could have come from the rainfall, or it could have come from the storm surge. Now, the storm surge is a key word that we need to be aware of. So a storm surge is when we have a rise in sea levels. So it's an abnormal rise in sea levels. It's not a little rise, that occurs during tropical storms. So a storm surge is a direct impact of a tropical storm. So we could say that a storm surge was a secondary effect. So it's happened because of the tropical storm, which has then led to this flooding. So we can see here that you know, it's very difficult to maneuver around, so this flooding could impact transport, which could then impact the movements of services such as ambulances and search and rescue. Similarly, we can see here that we've got lots of damage to shops, which is going to be an economic challenge, and that's because of the wind speeds. And we know that the wind speeds were just under 200 miles per hour. Okay. You know, also you could infer from this that this damage to the shops could lead to unemployment because people are not going to be able to work. Okay, let's move on to the next image then. So do the same thing. So analyze this photograph and then pause the video and annotate around this photograph or make a spider diagram, obviously if you don't have photographs in front of you, and then do the same thing for the next photograph, which is here, for the next photograph, which is here, for the next photograph, which is here. Now this one's interesting, and I'm actually going to pause here. So this was used as a site for the homeless people. So the homeless people would seek refuge in, it looks like some sort of church. Okay, so this was a response which tells us that the amount of damage to houses was very high. Okay. We can see here that this is showing us that, you know, there's lots of people on the streets, lots of people selling things on the streets. They're also here connecting to electricity lines. So that is because there may have been damage to the electricity cables. Now, you know, you can see how much the trees move when we only have like 50 mile per hour winds. So if the winds are traveling at 4 times that speed, there is going to be damage to infrastructure and to power lines. So if there's damage to electricity lines, then they're going to need to be able to have access to electricity in order to speak to people, to ask for help, to be able to communicate if there is an emergency and they need people to come and get them. Okay, and we can see here that this is the search and rescue, and we're near some sort of water body here. It's not clear whether it's actually the sea, because it looks like there's also debris on the other side of this. But start to infer what you can see from this. It looks like further along here, the road is completely cut off. So that would also create challenges for search and rescue and responses. And the fact that possibly they're in a helicopter suggests that the search and rescue was very difficult. They couldn't travel by foot or by car. They had to use helicopters, which obviously is going to cost more money. Okay. So what we're going to do for the final bit of this lesson is look at the effects of Typhoon Haiyan. And we need to categorise them into primary impacts or primary effects and the secondary impacts or the secondary effects. So a primary impact occurs as a direct result of a tsunami or a direct result of a typhoon. So, for example, buildings might collapse or farmland is flooded. Now, a secondary impact occurs because of the primary effect. So if buildings collapse, that means that people are made homeless. So that would be the secondary impact. If farmland is flooded, that means that there will be a lack of food and unemployment rates might rise. So that's also a secondary effect. So secondary occurs as a direct result of the primary. So I would write down that information there before you move on to the next slide. Okay. So the first thing you would probably need to do is you could either write down these statements, color-coded them, or you could take a screenshot of the slide, or you could write them down. So first of all, we have the primary impacts in one colour and the secondary impacts in another colour. So what we're going to focus on is going through, and then as we're going through, identify whether it's a social, economic or an environmental impact. So let's start with this one. 40,000 homes were damaged. So they were damaged as a direct impact of the tropical storm. So this would be a primary impact. Now it's talking about homes, so if we were then having to categorise this into whether it's social, economic or environmental, well, it's going to be economic because it's going to cost money to fix them, but it's also impacting people's lives, so it could also be social. Now, a secondary impact of this would be this one here, that over 600,000 people were made homeless. So this is going to put pressure on responses. So this could be an economic challenge and also a social challenge. 30,000 fishing boats were destroyed. This would be a primary impact. So let's now try and find a secondary impact because the fishing boats were destroyed. Well, this isn't just specific about fishing boats, but it does mention it here. It says that 3/4 of farmers and fishers lost their income, and the UN totaled the recovery cost for agriculture and fishing at $724 million US. So this is an economic secondary impact. And let's do two more together. There were shortages of water, food and shelter, which led to outbreaks of diseases. This is a secondary impact, and that is because there was destruction of farmlands, of flooding. So because the farms were destroyed and flooded, because the fishing boats were flooded, there was a lack of food. So this is a secondary impact, and it's because the major corn, sugar and producing areas in the Philippines were destroyed. Okay, so please go through and make sure you have a table that shows the primary impacts and the secondary impacts of Typhoon Haiyan, and that's all you need to do for this lesson.